Chapter 1. Into the Sand. The sandals didn't crunch against sand. They squelched into something darker, wet, heavy, alive. The Nile Valley, in its August heat, wasn't the desert the young soldier expected. It was green, verdant, crowded with papyrus, flies, and a sticky kind of silence that clung to the skin. The air smelled like earth, rotting plants, sweat, and river silt. Not the dry air of marching drills in Syria or Gaul. This was Egypt, but not the Egypt of scrolls or stories. Grain waved in the fields under a sky too bright to look at. Children ran through flooded paddies. Farmers guided oxen through water that reached the tops of their sandals. Slaves carried baskets of wheat to waiting carts, and overhead, ibis birds wheeled in great lazy circles. In the distance, a white shape shimmered near the horizon. A pyramid, but not golden, not gleaming. The limestone casing was long gone, looted, worn, or shattered. Only the crumbling bones remained, dust-covered and silent. To the legionary, it looked more like a ruined fortress than a tomb. Behind him, a centurion barked orders. The column was stretched thin along the mud-brick road, a caravan of iron and leather baking under the sun. The legion's banner drooped in the heat, and the sweat under his helmet soaked the fabric beneath. This wasn't home. This wasn't even the Empire. Not really. It was something older and deeper. Egypt had once been a kingdom, its last queen famously proud. Cleopatra. Her name was spoken quietly now, if at all. After her death, Egypt wasn't conquered by Rome. It was absorbed, bled to the machinery of empire. Octavian had declared it his personal province, and ever since, Egypt had been ruled not by senators or consuls, but by prefects, men of equestrian rank loyal only to the emperor. Not the Senate, not the people. And so the legions came, not in triumph, but in silence. Stationed at the edge of the known world to guard grain routes, monitor trade, and ensure the Nile's wealth flowed north. The soldier had been transferred from Antioch. Before that, he'd seen Cappadocia. But this was different. The gods here didn't look like Mars or Jupiter. They had jackal heads, falcon masks, and lion faces. And the people? They didn't speak Latin. Most spoke Greek. Some still used Demotic Egyptian. The soldier only knew enough to ask for water, bread, or directions. Anything more required a translator, usually a scribe from Alexandria, educated and proud. His orders were clear. Report to the fort near Nicopolis, outside Alexandria. But first, march. The Nile's flood had receded late this year, and the roads were a soup of clay and manure. The carts stuck. The mules balked, and the locals watched in silence from doorways painted in sun-bleached colours. He passed a shrine along the road. Old, cracked. The paint had faded, but the outline of a woman remained. Isis, he thought. Or maybe Hathor. It was hard to tell. The locals left bread at the base, and coins, Roman coins. That was the strange part. This wasn't a land in open rebellion. It had folded itself around Rome, adapted, but it hadn't forgotten its own bones. That night, camp was set near a bend in the river. The tents sagged in the humidity, and the mosquitoes whined in the dark. He cleaned his gladius with slow, practiced strokes, and listened to the voices around him. Some Latin, some Greek, and others he didn't recognize at all. One of the auxiliaries had a tattoo of Serapis on his shoulder. Another wore a charm with Anubis carved into bone. Rome was here, but it wasn't alone. As he lay back against his pack, the sky above was clear and endless. The stars were strange here. The constellations twisted, foreign, unfamiliar. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what home smelled like. Bread, ash, olive oil. Here it smelled like mud. And something else. Something older. Something watching. Chapter 2. The fort at the edge. The Nile narrowed and vanished behind them. As the soldiers marched south, the landscape changed. Green fields gave way to open scrub, then to lifeless stretches of baked earth. The road was no more than a path, winding between dust-coated stones and the occasional dying acacia. The sun grew meaner by the hour. By the fourth day, they had crossed into the province's forgotten end, a place even the desert avoided. Ahead at last, they saw it. A Roman fort, if you could still call it that. It rose from a slope of pale sand, like a half-buried tooth. The walls were made of irregular stone, patched in places with sun-dried mud brick. Some sections had collapsed entirely, leaving jagged openings filled with blowing sand. A low gate stood crooked on rusted hinges, shaded by a canvas tarp that flapped in the wind. Above it hung a cracked wooden plank. Castrum Vallis Thermi, the fort of the warm valley. It was not warm, it was blistering. As the patrol approached, no horns sounded, no guards shouted. A man in faded armour simply leaned out from a breach in the wall and waved them forward. His face was wrapped in cloth, his tunic bleached nearly white by the sun. No helmet, no formality, just tired eyes and a look that said, "You're not the first to regret this post." Inside the walls, silence reigned. There was no drilling in the yard, no shouted commands. The dust hung still in the air. A pair of auxiliaries crouched in the shade beside a broken column, sorting dried dates. Nearby, a mangy donkey stood tethered to a collapsed shed. No one seemed to notice the newcomers. The buildings around the courtyard were mismatched, a mix of Roman brick, local stone, and patched-up thatch. One structure leaned so badly it had been reinforced with wooden beams scavenged from carts. The barracks had no doors. Inside, bunks were crammed together in dark rooms, the walls scratched with names and old curses, some in Latin, some in Greek, some in symbols no one had bothered to translate. The shrine was worse. Once dedicated to Mars, the god of war, the statue now stood armless and half-defaced. Someone had drawn an Egyptian eye of Horus across its chest. Whether in mockery or desperation, no one could say, but no one had erased it either. That night, the new arrivals sat around a low fire, cooking whatever the quartermaster could scrape together, mostly beans and salted fish from months past. The conversation was thin. A few muttered jokes, a laugh that didn't last. Above them, the stars emerged, brilliant and sharp in the black sky. But no one spoke of home. This wasn't the Egypt from the poets. There were no golden temples or lazy riverboats. This was where Rome sent men it didn't know what to do with. Soldiers with stains on their records, officers without ambition, foreign auxiliaries who didn't speak the language. They came here to vanish, and the desert obliged. In the far tower, one man kept watch. He leaned on a splintered balustrade, squinting towards the eastern hills. Somewhere beyond them, the old trade road wound into the interior, towards settlements no longer marked on any official chart. Patrols had stopped going that way. Too many hadn't returned. And in places like this, the Empire rarely asked why. Chapter 3. Orders from Alexandria. The message arrived on a donkey. Not a legion courier or mounted scout, but a sweating boy from the nearest village, guiding a stubborn old donkey with a scroll bag tied to its flank. He didn't speak Latin, barely spoke anything at all, just handed the wax-sealed note to the duty officer and waited for bread. The note bore the red stamp of the Praefectus Egypti, the governor of Roman Egypt. The garrison hadn't seen a letter in months. The officer read it aloud under the shade of a sagging awning, while a dozen dusty soldiers leaned in. Their faces didn't change, but a few straightened their backs. It was a name they hadn't heard in years. Berenice Panchrysos. An abandoned port on the Red Sea, once built for gold traders, now little more than broken columns and wind-blown sand. But the letter didn't mention trade. It ordered a detachment to leave within 3 days. 5 legionaries, 2 auxiliaries, 1 translator. Mission: to confirm the status of a disappeared caravan that had left Koptos heading east, and never reached the coast. Last seen by a goat herder who claimed they melted into the hills like smoke. No further detail. Standard nonsense, the commander muttered, but it's official nonsense now. That evening, the chosen 7 gathered supplies. They drew water from the fort's well, bartered for dried dates and tightened worn sandals. One man prayed at the broken shrine. Another scribbled a message to a wife he hadn't seen in 4 years, though he doubted the papyrus would ever leave the fort. The translator was a Greek-Egyptian named Theron, thin as a reed but sharp-eyed. He had been raised in Alexandria, spoke Latin, Greek, and passable Coptic. He also had a knife scar across his cheek and an expression that suggested he never expected anything to go well. Still, he was respected, because in southern Egypt, language was everything. Latin meant nothing to a Theban farmer. Orders barked in the wrong tongue just got you silence. Or stones. Theron had once negotiated a grain shipment from a desert village that had never even seen a Roman. The secret? Don't start with orders, he'd told them. Start with a question. Before dawn, the patrol departed east. The desert changed with the hour. Early on, it looked almost peaceful. Wind-blown ripples of sand broken by thornbrush and the occasional caravan trail. But by midday, the heat thickened like cloth. The wind cut sharp. There was no shade, no noise, no movement. Just their own footsteps and the distant shimmer of red hills. The road east of Koptos had once been marked by milestones and way stations. Now the stones were missing or buried. The forts had collapsed. They passed a pile of bones at a crossroads, bleached white, picked clean. Animal? Human? No one asked. Theron muttered a word in Greek. Thermolabis. It means the place where heat takes everything. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the eastern hills. It wasn't far now, only a few more miles to where the caravan had vanished. They made camp in a dry ravine, surrounded by broken rock. No trees, no cover, just sand, sky, and silence. One of the auxiliaries took the first watch. He stood atop a boulder, eyes on the ridgeline. Somewhere beyond that ridge was the trade road, and somewhere beyond that, the ruins of Berenice. The night was windless, cold, still. Until the donkey brayed, short, sharp, and sudden. No one slept after that. Chapter 4. Smoke in the Hills. They broke camp at sunrise. The wind had shifted in the night, carrying with it the fine dust of distant salt flats, and something less natural, a burnt scent, faint but sour. Theron was the first to notice. He crouched, fingers pressed to the sand, sniffing. Charcoal, he said softly. Old. Maybe 2 days. The hills ahead were jagged sandstone, baked red and orange by centuries of sun. They marched slowly now, the donkey lagging, its flanks twitching with every gust of wind. The trail they followed was barely a trail at all, more a memory scratched into stone. They passed rock faces cut with ancient graffiti in Demotic script, older than the Empire itself. One of the auxiliaries made the sign against the evil eye. By mid-morning, they found the first marker, a broken cartwheel half buried in the sand, its wood blackened at the edges. Nearby, a discarded sandal. No blood, no bones, just silence. The translator Theron knelt beside it, his brow furrowed. Caravan, he said. Maybe 2 wagons, but no sign of the animals. He looked up. Or the men. They moved forward more cautiously. The patrol's leader, a veteran named Drusus, held his gladius low, and barked for the group to stay tight. In the Empire's heartlands, patrols were routine. But out here, on the eastern fringe, between Nile and Red Sea, nothing was routine. They crested the next ridge just before noon and froze. Below them, nestled in a narrow ravine, was the burned shell of a campsite. Blackened stones, scattered debris, and the scorched frame of a wooden crate. It had been a resting point, maybe even a supply post. Now it was just wreckage. But what struck them wasn't the destruction. It was the fact that someone had tried to clean it up. One of the soldiers pointed. "There," he whispered. On the far edge of the site, the sand had been smoothed by hand. Tracks erased, ash brushed aside, and a fresh pile of stones, a cairn, deliberately built. They approached carefully. Theron knelt again, brushing the rocks aside one by one. Beneath them was a piece of leather, a Roman satchel, its clasp stamped with an imperial eagle. Inside, a half-burned parchment and a shard of bronze shaped like a military rank badge. Nothing else. Drusus stared at it for a long time. "Not a caravan," he muttered. "One of ours." That changed everything. They searched until dusk. No bodies, no fresh trail, just signs that something had passed through. Something that left no trace but ash and confusion. One of the men joked nervously that maybe it was ghosts. No one laughed. They made camp without a fire, ate their rations cold, and in the dark, Theron spoke quietly to Drusus. "The locals talk about this region. Old stories. Something about cursed ground." Drusus snorted. "Everything's cursed out here." But he didn't sleep much that night, and neither did the donkey. Chapter 5. The cairn was empty. They left the burned camp before sunrise. The air was still, the wind gone. Their boots pressed into dry sand that gave no sound. Not even the donkey complained. It walked now with its head low, as if listening. Theron led them over a series of stony ridges where the trail dissolved into pale, flaking rock. The desert here was shaped by wind and time, not footsteps, no markers, no ruins, just a vast table of cracked earth where even vultures flew wide. Before midday, they reached a plateau scarred by sandstone outcrops. A clearing lay below, framed by jagged spires like broken towers. In its center, a cairn, already opened. The rocks had been pulled apart, scattered outward in a careless spiral. At its center was nothing but sand. No satchel, no badge, no remains. Drusus approached without speaking. He squatted near the ruins of the cairn and ran his hand across the sand, then the stone beneath it. A flat surface, and carved into it, with a soldier's hand, 3 letters, DNT. One of the auxiliaries said it before anyone else could. "Deserters?" No one answered. Theron circled the site. A few paces from the cairn, he found something sticking out from the base of a rock, a snapped bronze stylus, dulled with age but Roman in design. He held it up. "Someone was writing," he said, and someone else stopped them. The soldiers began fanning out across the area. It was Drusus who found the trail, not by tracks but by rhythm. Small signs along the stone, changes in wind-swept patterns, a broken twig from a desert shrub. He led 3 men into a narrow ravine that twisted behind the ridge. The others stayed with Theron, who had unrolled one of the old maps and was trying to align landmarks that no longer existed. Inside the ravine, the light shifted. The heat broke. Shadows formed pockets of cool air, and the echo of movement carried strangely off the walls. Around a bend, they found a heat ring, a fire long dead, but its stones still warm to the touch. Someone had been there recently, maybe that morning. A few meters beyond, the terrain narrowed into a steep shelf. One soldier slipped while climbing and reached for support. His hand landed on something soft. It was an arm. They dug with care. The body was half buried in sand and debris, twisted as if trying to crawl away. No blood, no wounds. The tunic was Roman, but torn, worn nearly to rags. The face had not decayed. The skin was burned inwards, as if scorched from the lungs out. Drusus did not give orders. The men simply stepped back. They wrapped the corpse in a cloak, left no markers, and moved on. When they returned, Theron had traced the cairn stones into a rough pattern on the ground, sketching something in the dust. Not a map. A symbol. "I saw this once in Alexandria," he said, "on a funerary stele, for someone who died in the desert." Drusus didn't reply. He looked to the eastern horizon. The light there was strange. Not dusk, not storm, just pale and empty. That night they didn't camp. They walked until the stars turned. When they finally stopped beneath a sloped rock face, no one tried to sleep. There were no jokes, no fires, no stories. But the donkey kept shifting its weight, ears twitching towards the wind. Not afraid, just waiting. Chapter 6. The Salt Road. Past the red hills, the ground changed again. The terrain flattened and brightened. Salt crystals glittered across the surface like frost, but the heat rising from it was dry and constant. This was the Eastern Corridor, a stretch of cracked salt basin used by Roman supply trains heading toward the Red Sea. The locals called it the Dry Sea. The patrol followed what was left of a Roman road. Most of it was buried under wind-blown sediment and salt crust, but the basalt blocks still appeared in places, dark and squared, cut with the precision of Roman engineering. Theron knelt to examine one. The stone was not local. It had been brought here from the Nile Valley, likely loaded onto camels at Koptos. A milestone appeared beside the track, half sunken and weathered. One of the auxiliaries brushed away sand. The inscription was Greek, still legible. It named Hadrian. The stone had been standing here for at least 70 years. Later, they came upon a ruined way station. It had once offered shade and water to passing units, but now the walls had collapsed. The well was dry. A single amphora lay on its side near the entrance, stamped with the mark of Alexandria. It had held oil or grain. Nothing remained. They camped nearby, using the shelter of a low ridge to block the wind. There was no fire. The desert here offered no fuel, and they needed to conserve oil. The donkey stood tethered to a rope looped around a stone outcrop. It had carried more than its share, and Drusus made a note to redistribute some of the load in the morning. Theron recorded their position on a wax tablet using a stylus worn smooth from heat. He kept his notes in both Latin and Greek. They were basic field records: terrain, distance, landmarks, nothing dramatic. Just the slow documentation expected of any patrol in Roman Egypt. The writing would be reviewed eventually in Alexandria, then copied and filed away in some office near the harbour. Drusus inspected the men's equipment. One man had lost a sandal strap. Another had a cracked belt plate. None of it would be replaced until they reached a garrison, which might be weeks away. They resumed at dawn. The road turned southeast. The salt became softer in places, breaking into pockets of pale powder where brackish water had once risen to the surface. They marched in single file, testing the ground ahead with a wooden staff carried by one of the auxiliaries. Near midday, they passed the wreck of a transport cart. Its axle had snapped, and the chassis was overturned. The wood had bleached under decades of sun, but fragments of iron nails still held parts together. A rusted chain lay curled beside it, likely used to tether a pack animal. No bones, no sign of a struggle, just a cart left where it fell. Theron paused to sketch the site on his tablet. He said it quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The caravan either turned back or never made it this far. No one replied. There was nothing to add. The desert did not announce its victories. Chapter 7. Checkpoint at the End of the World. They reached the Roman checkpoint just after midday. The station sat low and square against the glare of the salt flats, built from sun-bleached stone and cracked plaster. Each corner held a squat tower, barely 2 stories high. There were no flags, no horns, and no movement except for the wind skimming dust across the ground. A wooden placard leaned against a post by the entrance. The lettering, faded by sun and sand, was in both Greek and Latin. Only one word remained legible: statio, official checkpoint. Drusus raised a hand and ordered the patrol to halt. He approached the gate alone, Gladius at his side but untouched. From above, a voice called out in Greek, not Latin. Out here, even Roman soldiers defaulted to the local tongue. Alexandria may have spoken both, but the desert spoke Greek. A man appeared briefly on the tower wall, then quickly vanished. Moments later, the gate creaked open. An officer stepped through. His tunic was pale from months of sun. A silver clasp marked his rank, and a wax seal hung from a cord at his waist. A scribe followed him, tablet and stylus already in hand. Drusus gave his name and orders. Vallis Thermi, acting on a directive from Alexandria. The officer listened, nodded, and gestured them inside without a word. The courtyard was small, hemmed in by low buildings with flaking whitewash and iron hinges rusted to red. 2 large amphorae stood near the wall, half buried for stability. Theron uncorked one and let the donkey drink first. Then the men passed the jug between them. Inside the barracks, the air was dry and still. A shrine stood in the corner of the courtyard, fashioned from a converted toolshed. The god was hard to name. A Roman Mars helmet had been painted over with what looked like a Horus eye. The blending of symbols was neither neat nor respectful, but no one had cleaned it off. Near the southern wall, Theron stopped at a bronze plaque. The letters were dulled by time, but still readable. It named the original builders, the 10th cohort of the 3rd Legion, under the reign of Hadrian. That meant the checkpoint had been here for nearly a century. They were shown to the storeroom. It held sacks of grain, dried chickpeas, oil, vinegar, and a small barrel of wine marked for officer use. Everything was labelled and recorded. There was no excess. Theron sat with the checkpoint's clerk. The 2 exchanged scrolls and wax tablets, comparing movement logs and toll records. Only 2 caravans had passed west in the last 30 days. Nothing from the east, nothing from Berenice. One had stopped briefly. The other had refused to sign the log. Drusus met privately with the station officer. When he returned, he gave no speech. He simply told the men to rest. They would continue in the morning. That evening, the patrol ate beside the grain crates. No fire, just cold rations and quiet chewing. One auxiliary mended his sandal strap. Another repacked the donkey's load. Theron wrote by lamplight, etching his field notes in Latin and Greek onto a clean wax sheet. The checkpoint shut its gate early. The desert grew colder. The wind picked up. They slept on stone benches once meant for cargo. At dawn, they rose without prompting. There were no milestones ahead, no way stations, only a narrowing path across land the maps no longer named. But the orders were clear, and so they walked. Chapter 8. Meeting the Locals. By the 3rd day beyond the checkpoint, the terrain changed again. The salt flats gave way to coarse gravel, then to rocky soil with patches of dry grass. It wasn't lush, but there was life. Small thorn trees bent with the wind. Faint footpaths crossed their route, signs of people long before the Empire arrived. Late that morning, they saw smoke on the horizon. Not black and thick like after a raid, but thin and steady. Controlled. A cooking fire. Drusus raised his hand. The patrol slowed. No one drew weapons. This wasn't a battlefield. The trail led to a plateau overlooking a dry riverbed. On the far side stood 4 huts. They were simple homes built from sun-baked mud and reeds, sealed with lime. A clay oven smoked beside one of them. 2 goats grazed near a crumbling wall. An old man sat by the fire. He didn't get up. 2 women stepped from the shadows of the huts. One carried a small child. None of them looked afraid, but they weren't welcoming either. Theron stepped forward alone, hands empty and open. He spoke slowly in Greek. "We are Roman soldiers. We're looking for travelers who passed through here." The old man answered in another tongue, not Greek, and definitely not Latin. It was a local dialect from the Theban region. Theron caught the meaning from tone and memory. The rest he understood from the man's eyes and gestures. These people lived on the edge of the desert, just north of Wadi Hammamat. They were farmers and herders, living off whatever water the rains left behind. They said a group with wagons had passed weeks earlier, armed, not Roman, heading southeast. A few days later, the same road was empty. Drusus approached as Theron translated. He avoided using words like disappeared. Out here, rumors spread faster than the truth. The old man spat. "Your coins don't bring rain," he said. Still, the women brought a few dried dates and a clay jar of water. The soldiers accepted. In return, they left gifts, a copper ring, some clean linen, and a bit of salt. No threats, no demands. Just a quiet trade. Theron stayed to speak with the elder. They talked about the days when caravans carried gold from the desert mines, when Roman forts were busy with carts and builders. Now, even the jackals avoided the trade road. Before they left, one of the soldiers noticed a carving on a stone near the fire. It showed a falcon, worn and weathered but still clear, a symbol of an old sky god. Long ago, someone had scratched a Roman eagle over it, and later, someone else had scratched that eagle out, layers upon layers. That night, they camped beside a dry well under a stand of thorn brush. Drusus kept the watchers tight. Theron sat beside the donkey and wrote by lamplight. He recorded the site as a small desert village. 4 homes, 7 people. He also noted the carving, and the silence as they walked away. Rome was here, but it wasn't welcome. Chapter 9, The Edge of the Empire. They followed the dried riverbed for hours. It twisted between sandstone cliffs where ibex tracks and collapsed boulders told of older paths. The sun had not yet reached its peak when Theron raised a hand. He crouched, listening. Voices, not Latin, not Greek. Soft, rhythmic, echoing across the rocks. They slowed their pace. Drusus motioned for silence. The patrol moved forward in a staggered line, boots crunching gently on gravel. At the next bend they saw them. 4 figures, clothed in rough linen and wool, stood beside a low stone structure that had once been a Roman way station. One woman held a water skin. 2 older men leaned on staves. A boy watched from the shadow of the ruin. Their camels knelt nearby, flanks twitching in the heat. Theron stepped forward slowly, both hands open. He spoke in Greek first, then in a careful Coptic dialect. The woman responded in accented Greek, halting but clear enough. They were nomads, she said, of the Ababda people. Not thieves, not rebels, just passing through. Drusus stayed back, watching. His hand rested on his gladius, but he gave no order. The woman offered them water. Theron tasted it first, then nodded to the others. One of the auxiliaries grinned. A silent trade began. Dried figs for salted meat, a whetstone for a bundle of herbs. Nothing formal, just an exchange. As they rested in the shade of the half-fallen wall, Theron asked what they had seen on the trail. Caravans? Soldiers? Strangers? The older man spoke now. He gestured with 2 fingers toward the southeast. A group had passed some days ago, he said. but not like these soldiers. They were quiet, too quiet. Their footprints were light. The boy added that they did not speak, just walked, heads down, through the heat, and then vanished. Drusus frowned. Theron asked if they were armed. The woman shook her head. Not that she had seen. Later, the nomads led the patrol to a spring they knew of, barely a trickle from between two rocks. It took nearly an hour to fill a single flask, but it was clean. Theron carved its location into his wax tablet. He would report it when they returned to base. Rome kept records of everything, especially water. Before leaving, the boy approached one of the soldiers and handed him a stone carved with a symbol, part Egyptian, part unknown. The auxiliary looked to Drusus, who gave a single nod. The boy ran back to his family and vanished behind the rocks. They moved on that afternoon, heading east again. The terrain rose slightly, and the salt flats gave way to red soil and stony slopes. They were closer to the sea now. The wind carried seabirds' cries faintly from far away. Drusus said little. Theron walked with his tablet open, sketching the rock formations and noting the spring. It was the first time on this journey that they had spoken with anyone who wasn't Roman. No orders were exchanged, no treaties signed, but something had shifted. Theron looked back once toward the rocks where the nomads had stood. There was no one there now, just the desert, watching, listening. Chapter 10. The Long Road West. They left before dawn. No horn, no shouts, just boots in motion and the sky turning pale. Behind them, the ruins of Berenice Panchrysos lay still. Half-buried columns, crumbling walls, and broken amphorae scattered like bones, a forgotten port facing an empty sea. Once, it had mattered. Indian ships had docked here with silk and spices. Nubian caravans had arrived with ivory and gold. Rome had poured coin into its harbour, its granaries, its wells, but not anymore. The Red Sea trade had shifted. Other routes had risen. The desert had reclaimed what it could. Theron walked near the front, wax tablet in hand. He wrote sparingly now. There were few details left to add. No signs of the vanished caravan beyond fragments, scorched crates, a broken chain, stories traded in half-understood Greek. No answers, just silence. That was Egypt. It didn't defy Rome. It absorbed it. The desert didn't resist the legions. It buried them. Quietly. Patiently. By mid-morning, the patrol climbed a ridge that overlooked the dry sea. Below stretched the route they had followed for days, flat, white, and glittering with salt. Somewhere behind that glare lay the faint outline of the old road, half swallowed by sand. Far beyond, Coptos and the Nile. They stopped to rest beside a milestone, Greek inscription naming Trajan. It marked 32 miles from the coast. The stone leaned slightly now, sun-scorched and crusted with salt, but still standing. Drusus sat in silence, chewing dried figs. He had led patrols from Dacia to Arabia, but this one would linger. Not for what they had seen, but for what they hadn't. No rebellion, no battle, just traces, shadows, proof that even here, Rome walked paths older than itself. One of the auxiliaries began to hum in Nabatean. The others didn't know the words, but the rhythm carried. Out here, no one cared what tongue you spoke. Greek worked best, Coptic when needed. Latin was for paperwork. By noon, they were moving again. The donkey plodded steadily, its burden lighter than before. Theron had etched a message into the stone wall of Berenice before they left. No grand report, just a date, a name, and a note that they had reached the end. It would be weeks before they reached the Nile again. The fort at Vallis Thermae might already have a new commander, or be empty. Theron glanced back once. The coast was gone. The sea, too. Nothing behind them now but dust and mirage. He looked ahead again and kept walking.